Hey everyone, welcome back to Music Appreciation. I've got the calendar pulled up here so we can see what we're going to look at today and in the future. So for Friday, September 7th, I've assigned chapter 4 from the Mark Evan Bonds textbook for the song Behold Spring. And then you'll also be taking a quick reading quiz that covers this week's material. So that would be chapter 3 and 4 in that case. If you haven't already gotten your access to MyLab Music, that's the site, sort of the companion website for the textbook where you can listen to the recordings. So instructions for that, as I've pointed out, can be found on our Blackboard page on the left-hand column. So you'll have the access code and instructions there. This is what the site will look like when you get access to it. So it just kind of simply lays out the piece of music corresponding to each chapter. So you can click on that and then it will pull up a recording like this to listen to. Okay. So chapter 4, Behold Spring by Francesco Landini. To put ourselves in sort of a historical context, we mentioned this on Wednesday, but this is the historical timeline that we'll be working through for this first half of this semester. So starting in the Middle Ages, we're going to pick up there again today, and beginning next week, we'll move on into the Renaissance. And after we finish up this music history survey for this semester, we'll get into talking about pop music. So a reminder here, again, I mentioned this before, but the word medieval itself can be divided into root words that mean the Middle Ages. This is a very large time span, about 1,000 years from 400 to 1400. So of course there's a lot we can't cover, but hopefully we can see some of the early innovations in music composition and notation throughout these two pieces that we're looking at for the Middle Ages. I also mentioned on Wednesday a set of vocabulary words that are useful for us in the context of this discussion. Notation, of course, is important for us because until people can actually write music down on paper, it's hard for other people to study it later on in time. So we see the beginnings of musical notation during this time period. And we also distinguish music as being either sacred or secular. Sacred, of course, is anything used for worship purposes. And we looked at an example of sacred music from Wednesday in chapter 3, the plain chant Caro Mea. And today we're going to look at an example of secular music, which is a broad category meaning anything that is not religious. So you can think of dance songs or love songs as being great examples of secular music. Okay, so some context about where we would actually hear today's piece of music. This song, Behold Spring, belongs to the tradition of courtly love in the Middle Ages. And so I'll give you some examples of what constitutes courtly love, but this is basically a set of social practices that dictate the romantic interactions between members of the nobility, so noble ladies and noble men, specifically knights, and how they interact and sort of court each other, essentially. Concepts like chivalry, taking care of the weak, treating women with respect, are considered to be aspects that knights should follow. It also emphasizes purity in love, so always maintaining the woman's purity. This is not a sexual court practice, I guess. It's more of a sort of a pure romantic concept. I lost my train of thought there. And it's also a great example of secular music. So you can see here this is a medieval illustration of two members of the nobility practicing this social practice of courtly love. The man is offering himself to her, showing humility and respect. He seems to have given her some sort of gift right here. We can see he's got a horse and a coat of arms, so we know that they're both members of the nobility. So you can think of the knight trying to woo the lady as an example. Okay, so what we're going to expect in courtly love, more context here. It is, of course, aristocratic, so as the name implies, courtly love is practiced by noble lords and ladies in a royal palace or court. It's also quite ritualistic, so couples engaged in a courtly relationship conventionally exchanged gifts and tokens of their affair. So the lady would be wooed according to elaborate etiquette conventions. This is where you get the terms used today like courtship and courtesy. And she was constantly receiving from her lover gifts of songs. And today's song, Landini's Behold Spring, is an example of one of these courtly love songs. He might give her poems, bouquets of flowers, gifts, and other sorts of ceremonial gestures. Yet, for all of these gentle and painstaking attentions on the part of her lover, the lady is expected to return only small hints of approval, shadows of affection. Again, it's very much a pure concept without actual consummation of their love. It would generally be sort of a secret affair. The foundation for all of this and what makes it so exciting and electric is that the rest of the world is excluded. So in effect, the lovers compose a universe unto themselves, a special place with its own rules and codes, a location for a secret rendezvous. That's part of the fun. It's adulterous in some sense because courtly love, almost by definition, is extramarital. One of its principal attractions is that it offers an escape from the dull routines and boring confinements of noble marriage. And marriage during the Middle Ages was a very different concept than it is today. So during this time period, during the Middle Ages, it was really little more than a political or economic alliance for the purpose of producing royal offspring, whereas today we expect marriage to be more of a equal and loving romantic relationship. These courtly love affairs would be ways for people to seek out that affection and love that you wouldn't get in your actual royal marriage. And finally, it stems from a literary practice. So before it established itself as a popular real-life activity, courtly love first gained attention as a subject or theme in imaginative literature. So, for example, knights and their passionately adored ladies were already popular figures in songs and fables, and they eventually spawn a host of real-life imitators in the palace halls of medieval Europe. So that's some background about courtly loves, and again, the song that we're listening to today is an example of one of these court love songs. So our composer here, Francesco Landini, he is probably the most famous and also most prolific composer of music during the 14th century. He's Italian, and pretty much his entire output consists of secular love songs such as what we'll hear today. And here's a great illustration of him. And he was so famous, I'm going to switch over here, that much of his music was actually composed in a beautiful book right here called the Scorcioluppi Codex. And this is an incredible treasure of music and literature from the Middle Ages. And so you can see just the incredible level of detail we get here. And keep in mind that printing presses didn't exist during this time. So this would have all been written out by hand on handmade paper. This would have been incredibly expensive, and only the wealthiest members of society would be able to own something like this. It's also cool because we can see the development of musical notation here. We've got actual staff lines that the note heads can be laid onto to indicate specific pitch and specific rhythm. So it starts to look a little bit more modern. And I'm going to pull up this example of early medieval notation that we looked at on Wednesday, just to compare the incredible progress we've made by this point in time. So you can see here in this example, we've got the Latin text right here, because all sacred music would have been performed in Latin. And then we've got these kind of squiggly lines up above each syllable that indicate a very general sense of the contour of the melody, but it's not specific in terms of pitch or rhythm. So it's very, very vague. And the development of notation is important for us today, especially in the context of texture. So we'll talk about each of the 8 elements of music after listening to this piece, but I want to point out before we hear it the polyphonic texture that we get here. So chapter 3 was an example of early medieval chant, and that was an example of monophonic song. And that means, of course, that everyone is singing the exact same melody, same pitches at the same time in unison. There is only one melody and nothing else. Polyphony is basically the exact opposite. This means that we've got two or more melodic lines, each happening at the same time and each being equally important. So it's a much denser, complicated texture, as you can see indicated if you imagine each one of these lines as being its own melody. So Behold Spring is an early example of polyphonic music from the Middle Ages, and this relates to the development of notation because until you're able to, you need a more sophisticated system of notation to be able to actually write polyphonic music because it's much harder to coordinate multiple melodies at the same time. So that's important for our use today. To get the sense of polyphony in your ears first, I'll play you two quick excerpts of other examples of polyphonic music from the Middle Ages. So we're going to be listening for two independent lines, and it's probably going to sound a little bit strange to your ears, but keep in mind that this is, an early development. They're still kind of figuring it out. This is a great video too because you can also see another example of notated polyphony. Okay, so you might have noticed the two lines, one is moving faster, that's the top line, and then we've got sort of a bass drone happening underneath that. Here's another example, kind of a similar idea. Okay, so we just reached this section right here. So you might have also noticed that it's very, very melismatic, and you can see that, for example, on T, this syllable right here, we've got multiple notes following after that on the same syllable. So kind of really embellishing important words there. Okay, so let's return to Landini here. As we work through or listen through the song, of course, we want to analyze this piece according to our 8 elements of music. So be thinking about how to describe the melody, the volume and dynamics, rhythm, harmony, texture, which we've already discussed a bit, timbre, the form, and also the relationship between the text and the music. So I've created sort of a listening guide here for us, and we'll watch this as we listen to the piece. But how I've laid it out, we've got 4 strophes or stanzas. These are the different sections of text. Here is the original Italian, so we'll hear it sung in Italian. English translation here. You can see that this is a pretty happy love song about the beauty of spring and being in love. So perfect for courtly love practices. I've laid out the form here. And of course, form is how we distinguish between different sections that serve different purposes. So we're looking for either repetition, variation, or contrast. One of the best ways to label form is just to use letters. So I've done A and B here. And so if we look at the first stanza, behold spring, which makes the heart rejoice. It's the time to fall in love and to be of good cheer. So we'll say that is A. And you see the next stanza or strophe, we get different text. We see the air and weather bringing about gladness. You'll also notice as we listen that the music itself sounds different. We have a different melody. So this is an example of contrast, of course, so we'll label that B. When we return to the third strophe, We do have a different text than in 1 and 2, but you'll notice that the music, the background music, is the same. So we'll label that A. It's an example of a variation, essentially. And I labeled that specifically as A prime because it's not exactly a repetition of A. And then for number 4, we return to Behold Spring, which makes the heart rejoice. You'll notice that's the same text as up here in number 1, and also the music is the same, so we'll label that A. I've also made some observations about the melody over here. So we'll be looking specifically for melismas and cadences. Melismas are multiple pitches per syllable. So I've underlined the syllables in which you will hear a melisma. So in primavera, which means spring, of course, on the ma, M-A, you'll hear a pretty elaborate melisma, although the rest of it is going to be syllabic. And you'll also notice that we hear pretty regular cadences. And cadences are parts in a phrase that indicate that you've sort of reached the end. So you can think about that in terms of language. A cadence is the same way you can tell someone's finished a sentence. They reach a period, they pause, take a breath, and then continue on a different thought. So the cadences fall whenever we see a semicolon or a period. So they follow the shape of the text. Okay, so I'll pull up my Pearson MyLab music, and let's listen to this. It's a pretty short piece, only about a minute long, and I'll switch over to the listening guide. We reach a cadence, and now to B. Cadence, and on to A. So they're singing the same kind of melody as we got in the first stanza, the different text. Another cadence, and now on to 4. Okay, and that's it. So you may need to listen to this several times on your own and follow along with this chart to kind of see the different patterns that we're looking for. But luckily it's pretty short. Okay, so to summarize everything we've talked about, I've laid out a completed listening chart here for us. To describe the melody, and again, you would probably want to listen to this on your own and study this listening chart, but it's mostly smooth, conjunct, nothing too jumpy or leapy, and that makes it easy to sing and it makes it sound smooth and beautiful. And we also hear sentences punctuated by cadences. In terms of dynamics or volume, I don't think there's really anything too extreme. It's pretty normal, medium singing voice. There's the natural rise and fall with cadences, but other than that, it's pretty consistent. In terms of rhythm, here's another important aspect. If you recall chapter 3's example of plain chant, that was unmetered, meaning you can't really tap your foot along and find a consistent regular beat. But here we do have one, and you need a consistent beat with polyphony because you need to coordinate the voices. So if you listen to it again on your own time, try to tap your foot along, you'll probably notice a sort of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 pattern. In terms of harmony, it's mostly consonant, nothing too dissonant or harsh sounding there. Of course, it's a love song. The texture is polyphonic, as we mentioned. Talking about timbre, there are no musical instruments, it's only vocal music. And in this case, we've got women singing. The form we discussed, A, B, A, A. And looking at number 8, It's mostly syllabic with occasional melismas at the ends of phrases. Okay, so that's our discussion about Landini's Behold Spring. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you all have a great weekend.